Greetings and welcome to National Network View, Black Narrative Interviews. And today we're going to be talking about a serious topic, one that is on point and really follows up on the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan's historical July the 4th lecture. We have with us today Mr. Kevin Barrett, PhD. He is an Islamic studies and Arabic, an author, a radio and TV host, as well as a guest and expert on the false flag attack of 9/11 and Zionism. I would like to welcome Mr. Barrett to Black Narrative. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's good to be with you.
You too, and we're happy to definitely have you on here to talk about really what we could say is some very relevant topics today, especially with what we see going on with the protests and what the protests have revealed about the police training out of Israel, what the protest has revealed about the social and racial inequality. So to jump right on into it, we're talking about the training of the police coming out of Israel. Can you talk and give us a little bit of understanding of what is taking place there?
Well, yeah, sure. After 9/11, it seems that the Israeli security state became the model for the new paradigm. And I think that was deliberate. The Israelis had been going bankrupt before 9/11. They had, at that point, they were all invested in the dot-com bubble. And when it popped, then the whole country was going bankrupt, and Jews were fleeing Israel because of the Intifada, the bombings, and so on. And so they were in really tough shape. And then they took all their chips in early 2001, and they put them into security startups. And then they hit the jackpot with 9/11. It saved Israel financially, as Naomi Klein wrote in The Shock Doctrine. So they became the kings of security. They're the go-to people if you want to, use apps to follow your enemies and chop them up with a bone saw, as bin Salman did. They're the go-to guys. If you want to build drones to kill people, or if you want to train police to oppress people. And of course, they have a lot of experience running a country that's officially unequal. And so they train their cops and soldiers to treat Palestinians like dirt, like subhumans. Now, the United States, of course, was officially unequal for a long time. And now, even though it's officially equal, in reality, it's still unequal. So after 9/11, when they blamed these brown-skinned foreigners for blowing up the Trade Center when they actually did it themselves, they were able to then, to frighten everybody. And part of the fear-mongering was to bring in, to ratchet up the police state. And so who gets the worst of the police state? It's the it's poor people, minority people, African Americans. And who's going to train the police state cops to put their knees on the necks of those people? Well, the Israelis are perfect. They've got the most practice at it. So in a nutshell, I think that's what happened.
Right. And you say, like you said, since the 90s, they took advantage of the, as we are talking about, the false flag terror attack that took place during 9/11. And I want to just preference our conversation by saying that, we're not talking against the religion of Judaism. And we want to make that very clear that what we're talking about is the trope of anti-Semitism that is used by the Zionist cabal, basically to silence voices like Mr. Kevin and others, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan and others. So we definitely are going to hopefully make a distinction between the religion of Judaism and the secular branch of Zionism. If we can, the events of 9/11 pointed out the false flag operation and that it was an inside job. We have videos showing the demolition explosions that brought the towers down on their own footprint. the absurdity of believing that individuals learn how to fly a Cessna jet or some small aircraft, but then were able to take over an airliner. Not only that, but they were able to turn the airliner around without radar and find New York, find Manhattan Island, and hit the World Trade Center straight on without having to do a circle around. Can you talk about some of the other things that you've discovered in your research? And we want to also thank you because you were also a part of the War on Islam preliminary session at the Nation of Islam, where you also went into that.
Well, thank you. It was really an honor to address that session, and it was the biggest audience I've ever spoken to. And so I really have to commend the Nation of Islam for being in the forefront of organizing for truth and justice. Well, you mentioned, you did a good job summarizing the basics of 9/11. We could mention that Building 7 is the Achilles heel of the official story, because anybody can look at that building come down in 6.5 seconds, the first 2.5 seconds in absolute free fall with no resistance whatsoever, and see that that's an obvious controlled demolition. And then
we got mentioned that the building was not really hit by, it was not really on fire. And like you said, it just collapsed in its own footprint.
Yeah, for no apparent reason, except, of course, for the sounds of explosions, the New York police radio doing a countdown to demolition just before it happened, 3, 2, 1, and then boom. So that's really so obvious, and they covered it up in the mainstream media. They didn't even mention it for years. It wouldn't show it on TV, and I think it was 2007 or 8 when Stephen Jones, the physics professor, was on CNN. So there's a huge cover up there. And also you're right that the supposed hijackers, who were not even on the planes, but the story that they hijacked these planes and managed to turn them around and fly a beeline to the Trade Center and hit the towers at very high speeds, improbably high speeds, 550 and almost 600 miles an hour, is ridiculous. And then the Pentagon story is even worse. The Pentagon story, yeah, that's the guy who was not allowed to solo in a Cessna training aircraft, Hani Hanjour. And the 9/11 Commission said he was the best pilot of any of them, but they wouldn't let him solo in a Cessna. And anyway, he took over the plane over Ohio, and so, according to the official story, and flew it all the way to D.C. and did an amazing stunt maneuver, pulling a lot of G's, probably would have rendered everybody unconscious, and came skimming in along the grass to hit the far side of the Pentagon away from Rumsfeld and the top brass. So, I mean, these are just a few of the things. You know, we could go on forever about how the 9/11 Commission claimed in the report. You can look this up for yourself. They said that ultimately the matter of who paid for 9/11 is of little significance. Wait a minute, a mass murder and whoever pays for it, that doesn't matter. I always thought that would be the murderer, would be the person who hired the hitman, but I guess not in this case. And then they also told us that even though it turns out that it's true that people bought put options, they were betting that United Airlines, American Airlines, and Morgan Stanley Dean Whittier, which had a couple of floors in the towers, were all going to lose a huge pile of value on 9/11. They bought all these put options during the week prior to that. And the 9/11 Commission said, well, yeah, they did, but don't worry about it because we investigated, and the people that bought the put options and walked away with billions of dollars had no connection to Al Qaeda. So don't worry about it.
Right. And
so you
of
can't,
course, you know, with I think it was Silverman or Silverstein. Yeah, Silverstein. Mr. Silverstein also had, from what we hear, insurance on the 9/11 buildings as well before they fell. One of the things too that we want to look at is now the basically police state that we live in, and that goes really back to the police training. Now, even more than before, our basic liberties of freedom of speech, which unfortunately you've had to run into with your the attack on you when you started to bring these things out in, I think, 2005 or 2006, and then they went after you to get you fired from your teaching job at the university, and also to blacklist you from teaching at the colleges and universities. were you surprised at, I guess, the power that this unseen hand, the Zionist cabal had over not only the mainstream media, but the colleges and universities?
Yeah, I was surprised that they would suddenly push back that hard, but I wasn't really that unhappy about it at the time because I'd been screaming my head off for 2 years, and we were getting more and more traction among professors and people paying attention to alternative media and websites, but we weren't breaking into the mainstream. The mainstream was just completely ignoring the elephant in the room. And so when suddenly they attacked me, I was actually happy because here's a chance to actually get this information out into the mainstream media. And ever since then, I just keep running into people who say, I learned about 9/11 because I saw you on Fox News, and I wonder, well, why is this crazy professor saying these things? I should check it out. And they did, and then they looked at Building 7 and said, okay, that's he's right. But yeah, it is shocking how much power it's hard to tell precisely which cabals are doing what, but certainly the Zionists have a tremendous amount of power. We can see that with the way they're, for instance, not only covering up 9/11, which I think was largely orchestrated, or at least, I think the impetus for that came from the Zionists primarily. But the U.S. national security state was all in too, from the top. And with this Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine, or however you pronounce it, I call her Ghislaine in French, Ghislaine Maxwell thing, they're covering that up too. What they're covering up is that there's all kinds of evidence that he was blackmailing top American potentates for the Israeli military intelligence. And indeed, Ari Ben-Menaj, the former Mossad officer, has testified to that. He was there when these arrangements were made in the 1980s. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was a Mossad super spy, and he ended up blackmailing his spy masters, and then they killed him, threw him overboard in the ocean. And his daughter kept up working for the Mossad, apparently. And so Jeffrey Epstein was basically, filming people like Donald Trump and Bill Clinton and everybody else up at that level for the Mossad, giving him frequent flyer tickets on his Lolita Express airline, flying them down to his various, his island, and then he had a ranch in New Mexico and so on. And all of this, the fact that this was being done by Israeli intelligence, the whole thing is a big Israeli intelligence thing to control the top of the American political structure. You can't say that in the mainstream media. And this is shocking, that this tiny little country of 14, 15 million people, maybe less than that actually, has total control over America, can get away with this stuff because people in the media are running interference for them. It's just a scandal.
Absolutely. And like you said, with Jeffrey Epstein, a number of different things that are being covered up in Israel, because the narrative is not shown from the point of view of those who are being oppressed. And of course, we're talking about the plight of the Palestinians and the annexation. Really, still on the mainstream media, we don't hear anything really about the annexation of Palestinian land and how this is really leading to a, if you want, a powder keg in the Middle East. Can you talk a little bit about that, and a little bit also about certain things also being covered up that's taking place in the Holy Land, where you have, well, if you could talk about that, and then we'll go into a few other things that are taking place in Israel in the Holy Land with, and I'll just say really the sterilization of African women, and really the racism towards the Ethiopian Jews.
Right. Yeah, Israel is a profoundly racist society. And I mean, I usually don't even call it Israel. I call it occupied Palestine, because that's really what it is. It's not a legitimate country. And indeed, the United Nations never legitimized it. That vote was in the General Assembly, which has no power to create a country. So it's totally illegitimate. And it's based on systematic racism at a level that makes American racism look minor. I mean, these people, like this is extreme racism, the way they shoot people for sport. Yeah, we have cops that get away with murder here in the United States, no question about it. But, as Chris Hedges said when he witnessed these soldiers who were luring kids within sight of their guns by barking out obscene insults on the megaphones and then shooting the kids in the belly for sport in a way that would make them suffer the most before they died. Now, he said he'd never seen anything like that in any of these horrific war zones he'd been in before. And likewise, the Israelis have this habit of going up onto the hills and the mountains overlooking Gaza. Every time that Netanyahu decides to mow the lawn, he calls it, meaning murder thousands of civilians and ambulance workers. They blow up ambulances. They drop white phosphorus on UN installations. They shoot kids on the beach from helicopters. They just mass murder civilians. Every few years they do this. And the Israeli people, a bunch of them, go up onto these hills, and they have huge parties and barbecues and cookouts, and they cheer as the white phosphorus rains down on these Palestinians who are locked up in the world's biggest open-air cage. So this is a really racist society, and it's founded on racism. It's founded on Jewish supremacy. The whole point of it is, they're calling themselves a so-called Jewish state. And again, they don't represent the Jewish people, and all my Jewish friends agree with that. But that's what they call themselves. And then if they put this stamp on you that you're Jewish, then you're the master race, and you can drive on all the best roads, live in all the best housing, and so on and so forth. They put the stamp on you that you're not, then you're in trouble. Especially if you're native to that land, you're a Palestinian, then you're the lowest of the low, and your life isn't worth anything. So that's the kind of society it is. And because it's backed by many of the world's wealthiest, most powerful people, they've got the United States government running interference for them, and the media. Their friends totally control our media, and you go up against them, and they come after you, as you and the Nation of Islam know as well as I do.
Absolutely, absolutely, and some other things that take place, for instance, that's being covered up by the mainstream media. That would be the organ trafficking from some of the Palestinians. That's covered up. And in the Holy Land, I think it was outrageous for many of the Muslim nations to see gay pride parades being in the Holy Land by the so-called chosen people. So Israel, and as you said, there is a separation between the secular Zionist community and those that follow the Talmud. That's different from the Orthodox or the Jewish community that's in Israel, and there's a clash between these two cultures, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah. Israel was created by secular atheists. They didn't believe in God, but they believed that God gave them that land, and that whoever lived there had to be killed or expelled. And so these secular atheists were really, it was kind of a spin-off of messianic Jewish millenarianism, but a heretical version of it. See, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims have slightly different views of the end times. We Muslims and our Christian brothers and sisters agree that Jesus, Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, is the Messiah, and he's coming back in the end times. And Muslims, we say, with the help of the Mahdi. But the Jews have rejected the prophetic status of both Jesus and Muhammad, peace upon them both. And so the Jews say they're still waiting for their Messiah. And he's going to be a military conqueror who will subjugate the world for them. And so that's actually pretty mainstream in traditional Jewish thought. But then, about 500 years ago, what some people have called the synagogue of Satan arose, which is a heretical offshoot of that. And this idea would be that if they commit the worst sins and so on, and go against the religion and basically become Satanists, that will somehow force the Messiah to return. And Shabtai Zvi was the big name here, and then his follower in the following century, Jacob Frank, created Zionism by essentially doing a kind of heretical turn on the traditional messianic millenarianism. So those people, that actually ended up becoming kind of secularized. And so it's said, I can't absolutely vouch for the truth of this, but it's said that the Rothschild family, and it's not me that says this, it's Rabbi Antelman here, Rabbi Marvin Antelman, to eliminate the opiate, a very strict, observant Orthodox Jew, who says that the Rothschild family and their friends, who largely run the world today through their power over central banking, are followers of Jacob Frank, Shabtai Zvi. They're both kind of atheists, but they also do these kind of satanic ritual practices. So that's what the whole synagogue of Satan thing refers to. But among the ordinary people in Israel, they're split between the sort of atheist and secularist side, many of whom are basically decent people, liberal, well-meaning liberals who are confused about religion, in my opinion.
Right.
But many of them, actually, some of them are actually peace activists and so on. And then on the other side, you have the religious people, and among them, there are some very good people like Neturei Karta, the wonderful organization of Jewish anti-Zionists, and then there are also these fanatical settlers who believe that they're God's chosen people, and they want to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque so they can so-called rebuild a blood sacrifice temple, so they can bring on their Messiah who will subjugate the world for them. So there are all these kinds of currents of thought there, but what unites them all is a kind of messianic millenarianism. That is the idea that we have to overthrow everything and turn everything upside down, and then the world will be perfect. Communism is one example of this. Zionism, when the Jews go back to the Holy Land, the Messiah is going to come, everything's going to be great, we're going to rule the world. These kinds of strains of thought, including secular messianic thought, people who think that if we just get rid of all the old religions, everything's going to be perfect. So all of these messianic millenarian streams of thought are coming together over there in occupied Palestine, and it's a witch's brew. It's really the results are nasty.
And then you gotta throw into that whole mix the evangelical Christians who seem to be puppets for these false or Zionist individuals. Can you talk a little bit about that with Pompeo and some others who are in the Trump administration who seem to be bent on, from their perspective, bringing in this so-called Messiah or Savior or false Antichrist?
Yes, it's crazy how these Christians have been duped, or maybe they've duped themselves. But the Christian Zionists are, by and large, even crazier than the Jewish Zionists, and that's saying something. Their whole philosophy is that Jesus, peace upon him, the Prince of Peace, they think that the way to bring him back is to, commit bloodshed and abominations in the Holy Land. And then when he comes back, he's going to nuke everybody except for them. And he's going to beam them up like the Starship Enterprise in Star Trek. I mean, that's barely a caricature. I mean, that's almost pretty much what they think. And so these people are really crazy. And where did they come from? Well, there's the Schofield Bible that was written by a huckster, a con man, kind of like Trump, only probably not even as smart as Trump, a guy named Cyrus P. Schofield back in the 19th century, who was could barely scrawl his name in mud with a stick, but somehow he got a contract with, I think it was Oxford University, to do an edition of the Bible. Like, who gave this guy the right to do an edition of the Bible? Well, it looks like an agent of the Rothschilds was his main sponsor. And so that's probably where Christian Zionism really comes from. There's a big organized effort to cultivate it among the money power. Not just Jews, though. There are like homegrown Christian Zionists in the city of London. 19th century, there were a bunch of these Christians there, these hardcore Protestant crazies who had the same kind of bizarre, wish for bloodshed and horror in the Holy Land to bring on Jesus in the same way the Jews, or some of the heretical Jews, felt about bringing on their Messiah. So yeah, Christian Zionism, bad news.
And then you talked about, this end time scheme. Have you ever heard of the Samson option?
Yeah, I think that was the title of Seymour Hersh's book, and it refers to the Israeli nuclear program. They are said to have somewhere between 100 and perhaps 400 plus nuclear weapons that are aimed at all the capitals of Europe, all the capitals of the Middle East, and there are rumors that they also have nuclear weapons planted in American cities. So those are just rumors, but we pick up on them over at Veterans Today, where I write. And anyway, the Samson option, of course, refers to Samson in the Bible, who brought down the whole palace on his head and killed himself and everybody else. And so that's what they say they're going to do. If anybody ever forces them to give up their delusions of superiority and allow the Palestinians to live as equals in their own country, then they'll destroy the world. So that's what the Samson option refers to. And this Israeli nuclear program, by the way, was probably the reason that John F. Kennedy was killed. He was strongly against allowing the Israelis to develop nuclear weapons, and he was dead set on shutting that down. And it became such a problem that Ben Gurion, sort of the founding father of Israel, had to resign as prime minister of Israel just maybe 6 months or a year, less than a year ahead of the assassination. And when he resigned from prime minister, that led him to probably taking over the plot that culminated in the murder of President Kennedy. There were others involved in killing Kennedy as well, including hardline American militarists. People like James Douglas have written about that. But I do think that the Jewish Zionist role in this, with ethnic Jewish, not religious, totally atheist, ethnic Jewish organized crime, was a key factor in killing JFK, as well as in 9/11. As Laurent Guyonneau wrote in his book, JFK 9/11, the same group turns up in both of these coups d'etat.
Right. And we also know that from what the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan points out too, is that one of the things that he wanted to do is to start printing the money, that the Federal Reserve prints the money, and the Federal Reserve is a privately owned organization. It's not even a part of the federal government, no more than Federal Express is. But that also, they're saying, is something that led to his murder or his assassination. And also, when you talk about terrorism, and particularly the mainstream media that is controlled by them likes to talk about Muslim terrorism, but in the establishment of Israel, you had the Stern and the Irgun gang and them blowing up the British. Can you talk a little bit about that and the betrayal of the Balfour Declaration or agreement?
Well, that's right. Israel was founded on terrorism, created by terrorism. And there's a very good book on this. It's called State of Terror by Thomas Suarez. And Suarez documents how it was incessant Zionist terrorism going on from the 1920s right up through the creation of so-called Israel in 1948 and beyond that created this state. They terrorized everybody. They were bombing and assassinating Jews as well as non-Jews. The so-called sanctity of Jewish life didn't seem to mean too much to these people. The Stern gang was this notorious terrorist gang responsible for a lot of the horrors, and it became the forerunner of what then became the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So what we had here was a terrorist group that was vastly nastier than Al-Qaeda, which then became the official armed forces of the so-called State of Israel, which reveals what a gangster state and a terrorist state it really is.
Mm-hmm. And like we're saying, they're training the U.S. police with these same tactics that they use on the Palestinians. So the same knee on the neck tactic, the same crowd control tactics you see going on in Israel are going on in the United States. But as you said, at a much lesser severe degree, because if you go on the web now and you look at some of these videos, just like you're saying, there's videos capturing them doing just what you said with shooting down these Palestinians and a number of other things. I mean, we just can't go into all of it, but let's talk a little bit about the Iranian deal. It said Iran and the destruction of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and normally called the Iranian deal. Can you talk about really, I guess, some of the motives behind why Trump ended this deal so abruptly? Sure.
There was a feud going on between Netanyahu and Obama. I think that this long story short here is that Netanyahu and his friends were big players in 9/11, and they had a lot of influence in the Bush-Cheney administration, especially on the Cheney side. And then the American deep state pushed back against them, viewing them correctly as extremists. And so when Obama was elected in 2008, the more sort of American deep state of so-called realists took over, or at least assumed more power, and the extremist Likud neocons, who were friends of Netanyahu, were sort of sent back a few steps to the background. And so then Obama and Netanyahu didn't get along, probably mostly because, Obama's a slick and reasonably sane individual, whereas Netanyahu is a psycho gangster. Now, I'm not a big fan of Obama, but I'll at least grant him this. This was one of the good things he did, was notice how insane Netanyahu was, and he talked about it with the French president and others. There was a whole transcript of their talk about Netanyahu. So there was trash talk. They hated each other, and so they had this feud going. And Obama pushed through the JCPOA, which Netanyahu didn't want, because basically Netanyahu just wants all-out war on Iran. He tried to talk his own military and intelligence into attacking Iran a few times and got shot down. He knew that the best way to do it would be to trick the Americans into doing it, but Obama he wasn't having it, and he didn't like Netanyahu personally. So then I think Netanyahu and his friends helped arrange for the election of Donald Trump. And Trump has been a kosher Nostra asset from the get-go. He was created by Roy Cohn, who is the gangster chief of New York City. He posed as a lawyer, but he never litigated anything. If he went up against you in court, basically you got a tap on the back, and it's like you do this or you're dead meat, because he was taking orders from people like Meyer Lansky and J. Edgar Hoover. If somebody had to be eliminated or made, J. Edgar Hoover would call up Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn would see to it that this person was elected to the Senate, this person suddenly died, et cetera, et cetera. And where was Hoover getting his orders? Probably from Meyer Lansky, who was the chief of all organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. So Roy Cohn... And
not to interrupt, but J. Edgar Hoover also used those same tactics that you were talking about with Epstein, blackmailing a lot of elected officials.
Absolutely, yeah, and then of course the gangsters, Meyer Lansky and his friends, had dirty pictures of Hoover, and they were blackmailing him, and that's why Hoover spent his whole life denying that there was any organized crime in America, because he was part of it. So anyway, he gave orders to Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn ran New York for him, and Roy Cohn handpicked Donald Trump. And there are these pictures of Roy Cohn, like, practically leading Trump around on a leash. They're both dressed up like some kind of Roman orgy at these sick and decadent, twisted, Freemasonic Halloween parties and stuff. There are a lot of rumors about the nature of their relationship. But what we know is that Cohn was the older guy, and he was a pedophile. And Trump was his made man, his boy toy, probably. That's where Trump came from. And so Trump, then what does he do? He spends his whole life laundering money for the mob. Hotels and especially gambling. What good is that? Money laundering, especially gambling. Gambling, you walk in with these chips and you change it to cash. You just laundered a big pile of money. So that's what Trump's been doing all his career. And Trump Tower is the headquarters of the Russian mafia for the whole Western Hemisphere. So, the Russian mob took over in the 90s. They did it through, they took over Trump. Before that, Trump was running he was working for the local kosher Nostra, and then the Russian version moved in. And so that's the group that basically put Trump in power, and they are tight with Netanyahu and these extremist Likud party fanatics. And so they put Trump in power, and Sheldon Adelson gave him $100 million plus. So Trump has to pay back all these favors. What does he do? He hands Jerusalem to Netanyahu, which is Jerusalem al-Quds is sacred to all the Jews, Christians, and Muslims of the world, 5 billion people. And yet now it's been stolen by one tiny little group of the Middle Eastern monotheists. And this would have been an outrage. Nobody else would have done this, but Trump, being completely owned by this crime syndicate, had to do it. And likewise with tearing up the JCPOA, which was all about basically stopping this project of Israel using the United States to destroy Iran. And that was what 9/11 was about, was to just get the U.S. to destroy 7 countries in 5 years. And the seventh and biggest on the list was Iran. And this was to be done on behalf of Israel. And it didn't happen because the realists pushed back under Obama. But then Bibi Netanyahu and his friends got Trump into office, and now they're back at it again, waging everything but all-out war in Iran. They've shredded the JCPOA. They're handing what's left of Palestine over to Netanyahu. And it's quite an outrage. And sometimes, I know people who've fallen for some of Trump's snake oil, and trying to get this through to them is difficult. People, they get brainwashed by one side or the other. They think the left or the right is good. Either Trump or the Democrats are good. Well, no, none of them are any good. Least of all Trump.
Right, right. Biden included, like you said.
Oh yeah.
You know, under the Obama administration, just like you said, they went in, they bombed Libya, killed, assassinated General Muammar Gaddafi, and then you know the Trump administration or regime, they followed this up with the assassination of General Soleimani, and then the cover up that I mean, we could go into so much. There's so much corruption between the unholy trinity, if you will, with America, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. We won't take up too much more of your time. Hopefully, we can have you back to discuss some more of these issues. But I wanted to end off with talking about how this unseen hand once again. Almost like forces. I don't know what it is, but like you said in one program, you talked about how Roger Waters, Ilhan Omar, and others are made to capitulate and write these open letters of apology. And individuals like you, Cynthia McKinney, and of course the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan never bow down to these forces, which is very commendable. Can you talk about that, and we'll end it up with, if you can give us the name of your books, your website, your Twitter address, and so forth.
Right. Yeah, I'm still shaking my head about why did Roger Waters apologize for telling the truth about Palestine? Why Helen Thomas apologized, the senior White House correspondent for decades, generations, and then she tells the truth to some crazy rabbi. He puts it on YouTube. She says, "Yeah, I mean these Zionists should go back to where they came from," and now she has to go down and bend on her knees and apologize. And who else? Yeah, Ilhan Omar did this kind of crazy apology. And what's the point? They're still going to go after you, right? Exactly. Helen Thomas didn't win Zionist friends, and they didn't her career was over anyway. Why did she bother apologizing? Roger Waters, I mean, they hate him anyway. They're going to do everything they can to stop him anyway. Why does he apologize? And Ilhan Omar, they're going to try and take her out in the primary election. They've got this big, well-funded opponent. They're going to get rid of her, or try to anyway. So why did she bother apologizing? They're going to come after her anyway. And I think maybe it's just realism that right. People like Cynthia McKinney and the Honorable Minister Farrakhan know that there's really no point, because if you bow down and apologize and grovel and kiss their feet, they're just going to keep on beating you up. So why bother?
As the saying goes, they never forgive and they never forget. So as you're saying, it's pointless. You might and then when you do apologize, it makes you look so absurd in the eyes of those who know that what are you apologizing for? Telling the truth for? That's absurdity on the highest level. So but like I said, we won't expend too much more of your time. If you could please give us your books, your contact information, if you will, and some of the projects that you have coming up in the future.
Well, my website is truthjihad.com, and my first book is called my first 9/11 book was Truth Jihad. And I have various other books out, and the most recent was from a few years ago. I translated and introduced Laurent Guyeno's book called From Yahweh to Zion, which is, I think, maybe the best book ever written on the Jewish question. It's fair-minded, but it's not apologizing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'm working on coronavirus issues now. I may be able to get a book out on that. I think that it's biological warfare. I'm not sure if the Zionists are even involved in this one. I think it's more U.S.-China big power politics, but there may be a Zionist angle. We'll have to wait and see.
Right. I absolutely agree. And looking at it, of course, from the nation's point of view, also that and as you said on some previous shows, and it says in the Quran that the Jews plan and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners. So we can see that this pandemic, as they always try to use these biological weapons to go the way that they want them to go, it always ends up a big failure. And this is probably one of the biggest failures that will take place. But with that, I want to thank you, Mr. Kevin Barrett, for coming on here. Once again, Mr. Kevin Barrett is a PhD in Islamic Studies and Arabic. He's an author. He's a radio and TV personality, a host, and also a guest on many shows. And thank you for coming on to this program, Black Narrative. And may God continue to bless you, Mr. Barrett, with safety and continued success. And if you could, I'm going to close out, but we'll talk to you just for a few moments after the program.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, sir. And for those who are tuning in, we want to thank you for tuning in. One of the things that we definitely want you to understand is that this is not an anti-Semitic, and truth be told, once again, the mainstream media doesn't even let you know that the Palestinians are Semitic, and that the treatment of the Palestinians by the Zionist state of Israel is anti-Semitic. So we just want to let you know that we're not pushing any type of anti-Semitism, but what we do want you to understand is there is a difference between Zionism and Judaism. They are not the same. And so these Zionists, just like these terrorists in Islam, they hijack the religions and put their name on these righteous religions. So with that, we want to thank you. Continue to study and research for yourself, and may God continue to bless you and your family with the light of truth and understanding and safety. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.